I don't understand what's going on with the forthcoming election.
What do you mean?
Why is it even close? 8 years ago, when I was just a teenager, it was obvious even to me that there was something seriously wrong with Trump. Why hasn't every adult learned that he's a malignant narcissist? He's a criminal who has been convicted of 34 felonies and faces dozens of more felony charges in cases where the publicly available evidence makes it seem he's obviously guilty. He's a misogynist who has bragged about assaulting women, been found guilty of sexual assault, and fined tens of millions of dollars. He's not only psychologically unhealthy, but he's physically unhealthy. He's obese, weak, and unfit. He's so obviously unfit to be president that dozens of his former staff who work with him closely won't support him, including his own vice president. Even his top general called him, quote, fascist to the core, end quote. He wants to use the military to silence his domestic opponents. He craves power and wants to be an autocrat. He's undisciplined and lacks intellectual curiosity. He behaves like a mafia boss. He's shameless and an embarrassment to this country. He abuses our allies and cozies up to tyrants. He's an inveterate liar. He not only can't laugh at himself, but he has no sense of humor. He's the worst president in U.S. history, even worse than Nixon. He tried and failed to overthrow the government and wants another chance. And I could go on.
So hardly one of your idols.
Not hardly, although I don't hate him. Perhaps he's trying his best and just thoroughly ignorant of how to live better. Given that Harris is a reasonable alternative, I'm clueless about why nearly everyone isn't in her camp.
You've raised an interesting question, and there's also a host of related issues here as well. What is a person? In other words, what is a human being? How should we evaluate another human being? What about all the contentious policy issues and not just values that separate Harris and Trump? However, let's just focus on evaluating Trump and the appeal he has for some voters. How? What's the single most important criterion when trying to understand another person?
I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with the ability to love.
Yes. As a matter of fact, it's directly related to that. It's one's personal consciousness calibration or level of consciousness. The important mistake here is to think that we all live in the same world, that reality is the same for each of us. It's not. The world we each inhabit is a function of our level of consciousness. It determines how we experience life. Suppose that you and I have the same level of consciousness. If so, we live in the same reality. We probably have similar values and are inclined to like each other. Other persons with a significantly different level of consciousness live in a different world.
What's a level of consciousness?
Ultimately, every object is energy. Even if it's very small, each object has an energy field that can be calibrated according to its measurable effects. Realizing this is an important advance in the last 30 years. Because it's measurable, it's possible to determine what works to raise it and what doesn't. An increase in the frequency or vibration of energy corresponds to a higher level of consciousness. The higher that level, the less distorted and more accurate one's perspective.
So the higher one's calibration, the more truth one apprehends.
Exactly. The lower one's calibration, the more delusion and dissatisfaction one experiences. The higher one's calibration, the more abiding love, happiness, peacefulness, and bliss one experiences. That's why trying to raise our personal calibrations is important. When we seriously emulate and succeed in living more like the greatest human beings such as the Buddha and Jesus Christ, the quality of our lives improves.
So Trump's reality is more delusive?
Yes. His reality is what others of similarly low levels find appealing. The good news is that nobody's level of consciousness is fixed until death. It can rise or fall, sometimes quite significantly.
Fascinating. Please tell me more about that.
Dr. David R. Hawkins was a philosopher, psychiatrist, and spiritual teacher who developed a logarithmic map of all possible levels of human consciousness from 1 to 1,000. At each moment, each of us has a specific, overall level that can be measured or calibrated. To live better and become wiser, simply emulate the wise and stop doing what the foolish do.
Is it like a bell curve with 500 at its midpoint?
No. 500 is, though, the midpoint between the lower objective domain of matter and the higher subjective immaterial domain. The most important division occurs at level 200. Those whose personal calibrations are 199 or lower are living selfish, hellish, emotional lives in the domain of force, which is below the level of integrity, truth, empowerment, and love. Those factors rise from 200 to 599. Genuine love appears at 500 and unconditional love appears at 540. Sages, who live the best lives, have personal calibrations of 600 or higher. They are less than 0.5% of the population. The second most important division occurs at level 500. Ultimately, persons with calibrations of 499 or lower live in fear, whereas persons with calibrations of 500 or higher live in love.
What are the percentages below and above 200 and 500?
They relate to the collective cultural context. As Americans, we're very blessed in terms of our social environment because our national average for adults is about 422, whereas the worldwide average for adults is only about 205.
Wow! We're lucky.
Yes, it is luck. That doesn't mean that we're better than non-Americans. Every human being has the same value as every other human being. Our collective conditioning has enabled us to flourish as individuals more than many others around the world.
What about 500?
96% of humans calibrate at 499 or lower, so only 4% calibrate at 500 or higher. That's why the 1,000-point map is not a bell curve. What we think and believe conditions what we experience. 96% of us are obstructed from living lives of abiding fulfillment and satisfaction. Many people, even Americans, have thoroughly egocentric and criminal mindsets of 199 or lower. It's no wonder that even millions and millions of Americans are lastingly dissatisfied.
That's where Trump and his voters are?
As for Trump, I don't think his calibration was ever higher than 200. It's dropped to about 170. That's why many commentators have recently commented about his apparent cognitive decline. Not all of his supporters calibrate below 200, but many and possibly most of them do. The others may mostly be single-issue voters who happen to agree with him about one issue and don't care about anything else.
How does that affect them politically?
Basically, there's no truth, integrity, or empathy in the life of anyone with a calibration below 200. It's all self-centered, emotionally egocentric, divisive content. The point of gaining political power for anyone like that is to reward oneself and one's friends and to punish everyone else. That's always been the motivation for tyrants, dictators, authoritarians.
Whereas Harris and others like her think that power should be used to help everyone live better? She really does want to serve and elevate everyone, whereas Trump only really cares about himself.
Yes. The 400s are the domain of rationality. Being rational is better than being emotional because it's less egocentric. The 300s are the domain of emotionality. It's no surprise that her calibration is about 475.
So she calibrates at about 300 levels higher than Trump.
Yes. She calibrates significantly higher than the American average and he calibrates way, way lower than the American average. She is not only able to outthink him, but, more importantly, she is able to outlove him. She's not stuck in total egocentricity. That's the underlying reason why many Republicans, who may agree with Trump on more policy issues than they do with her, won't vote for him. They realize he's unfit for the office and bad for the country. He'll not hesitate to continue to destroy our institutions if he thinks that doing so would be good for him. For example, the United States Constitution calibrates at 710, which is 540 levels above Trump's calibration. Of course, he has no respect for it or understanding of it. He, like others who calibrate below 200, really does not care about anyone except himself. It's not merely a character flaw, it's a kind of insanity. It locks him into a fundamental ignorance of reality.
So that's why sages like the Buddha and Jesus both said that the fundamental problem is one of ignorance. That ignorance is built into a flawed or delusive view of reality.
Exactly. Not only that, but there are millions and millions of people who have similar, fundamentally flawed worldviews. They have control over many of our institutions from local schools to the Supreme Court.
That's depressing. Is there a cure?
That's an open question. At least in theory, there is, and it's simple. As individuals, we're able to improve the quality of our lives simply by emulating the wise, and Dr. Hawkins's map of the levels of consciousness enables us to determine which of us are wise and worthy of emulation.
I'd like to know more about that.
It's all about non-attachment to divisive thoughts to which most people are fanatically attached. Hawkins wrote a number of helpful books. If you are willing to read multiple books of his, start with his trilogy, namely, Power versus Force, The Eye of the I, and I. If you are willing to read just one, read Letting Go. For a short, clear introduction, read Dr. Bradford's Living Well According to David R. Hawkins. The best living spiritual teacher is Eckhart Tolle. As you'd expect, his teachings are very similar to Hawkins's. Again, the main idea is simple: find out which humans have lived the best lives and emulate them. Most people don't bother, with the predictable result that they live lives of, as Thoreau famously put it, quiet desperation and then just grow old and die. That's foolish and unnecessary. In fact, Dr. Bradford has a short, free PDF that's very helpful. Just go to his website at endfearfast.com if you'd like a copy.
I intend to do that. So wisdom really does have practical value. It's not just some theoretical idea. It's a choice.
Yes. Wisdom is not merely an object of thinking. Wisdom is to be practiced.